Get out of here and stop acting like you're some kind of savior. You're just trouble in a robe." Officer Brett Harlan's grip tightened around Father Elijah Boone's arm, dragging him away from the altar as the communion tray slipped and clattered across the marble. Gasps rippled through the congregation, church members frozen in shock as they watched their priest handled like a criminal in the middle of Easter Mass. "This ain't your kingdom," Harlan snapped, his voice cutting through the silence. "Feeding strays doesn't make you a leader. It makes you a nuisance." No one moved as Harlan paraded Elijah down the aisle, past trembling hands and tearful eyes, straight toward the church doors. Elijah didn't resist. He walked steady, eyes forward, dignity unshaken. Harlan leaned in, smirking. "Time you learn your place." And not one person in that church realized yet. This moment was about to change everything. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The morning sun streamed through the stained glass of St. Bartholomew's Church, casting jewel-toned light across the worn wooden pews. Father Elijah Boone stood in the vestry, his hands steady as he arranged the communion vessels on a silver tray. At 58, his face showed lines of both joy and worry, but today his eyes held a particular light. Easter Sunday, Resurrection Day, when hope rose from the darkest places. He smoothed his white and gold vestments, breathed deeply, and whispered a private prayer. "Father?" The church bookkeeper appeared at the doorway, clutching a folder. "The collection counters are ready, and the choir's all here. It's going to be a full house." Father Elijah nodded. "Thank you. And the meal tables outside? Your sister has everything under control. 25 tables, just like you wanted." Outside on the church lawn, Lena Boone directed volunteers with the efficiency of someone who'd once commanded medical units. At 52, she moved with purpose, her short cropped hair catching the morning light. "Those tables need to be farther apart," she called, pointing. "People need room to move between them, and the dessert station goes under the oak tree for shade." She paused, noticing a police cruiser parked across from the church. It had been there for nearly 30 minutes. Too long for a routine drive-by. Lena frowned but kept her thoughts to herself. Near the church entrance, Jamal Turner helped Mrs. Washington up the steps, supporting her elbow with gentle care. "Take your time, Mrs. Washington," the 19-year-old said. "No rush at all." "Bless you, child," the elderly woman replied. "Your mama raised you right." Jamal smiled but felt a small ache. His mother had done her best. But after his father went to prison, it was Father Elijah who'd shown him what a good man looked like. Father Elijah who'd helped him apply for college, who'd believed he could be more than another statistic. As he helped Mrs. Washington find her usual seat, Jamal glanced out the side window and noticed 2 police officers standing beside their vehicle, one talking into his radio. Something about their posture made him uneasy. In the front pew, 70-something Miriam Vale arranged her hymnal and Bible, her back straight as a ruler, despite her years. She wore her finest Easter hat, pale blue with a satin ribbon, and pearl earrings that had been her mother's. As a widow and longtime member, her position in the church was unquestioned. Which is why she noticed immediately when Councilman Greaves and his wife took seats near the back instead of in their usual spot up front. Interesting, she thought, watching them whisper to each other. They're distancing themselves. Miriam turned and saw the police cruiser through the window. Her mouth tightened. She knew what trouble looked like before it announced itself. The sanctuary filled quickly. Regular members in their Sunday best sat alongside families in less formal clothes, motel residents, day laborers, single mothers with children in hand-me-down Easter outfits. All welcome at St. Bartholomew's. When Father Elijah processed in behind the cross-bearer, the organ swelled and the choir began the resurrection hymn. His deep voice led the opening prayer, and the congregation settled in. Today, Father Elijah began his sermon, his voice warm and steady. We celebrate an empty tomb. But what does that emptiness mean for us who are still here, still struggling? He looked out at the faces before him, white, black, Latino, Asian, all together in this one place. Resurrection isn't just about what happens after we die. It's about refusing to let fear keep us in our tombs while we're still alive. His voice strengthened. What good is an empty tomb if the living still kneel to fear? A murmur of Amen rippled through the congregation. This town has many tombs, he continued. Hunger that keeps children trapped. Addiction that buries our brothers and sisters. Walls between neighborhoods. Policies that decide whose needs matter. Lena, standing at the back, saw several town council members shift uncomfortably. Christ didn't rise to give us comfortable religion, Father Elijah said. He rose to show us that love defeats death, that the stone can be rolled away, that no one is beyond redemption or beneath dignity. From his seat, Jamal noticed Officer Harlan step into the narthex at the back of the church. The officer's hand rested on his belt near his holster. Behind him, Officer Pike looked decidedly uncomfortable. When we feed the hungry outside today, Father Elijah continued, when we welcome those some would turn away, when we refuse to abandon the unwanted, we are practicing resurrection. We are rolling stones away from tombs. Miriam Vale's eyes narrowed as she watched Harlan whisper something to Pike. She'd known Brett Harlan since he was a boy, always too quick with his fists, always needing to prove himself the biggest man in the room. Father Elijah moved toward the conclusion of his sermon. On this Easter morning, I ask you, what stones need rolling away in your heart? Who have you buried with your judgment? What courage needs to rise in you today? The congregation was silent, hanging on his words. Because resurrection isn't passive. It's an act of holy defiance against everything that deals in death. As Father Elijah finished, the choir began a soft, stirring anthem. He stepped toward the altar to prepare for communion, his movements dignified and measured. The golden cross on his vestments caught the light as he turned. And that's when it happened. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the sanctuary swung fully open. Officer Brett Harlan and Officer Nolan Pike walked down the center aisle in full uniform, their boots loud on the old wooden floor. The choir's voices faltered, then fell silent. A collective intake of breath filled the sanctuary. The officers didn't stop until they reached the altar steps, standing directly between Father Elijah and his congregation. Officer Harlan's hand remained on his belt, his stance wide, his chin lifted with authority. The Easter joy that had filled the sanctuary just moments before evaporated like morning dew under a burning sun. Officer Brett Harlan stepped forward, puffing his chest out. His eyes swept across the congregation with undisguised contempt. St. Bartholomew's Church is in direct violation of Public Safety Ordinance 42B, he announced, voice booming through the sanctuary. You're harboring unauthorized occupants in the parish hall and serving food without proper permits. Shocked gasps rippled through the congregation. Father Elijah stood perfectly still at the altar, his purple Easter vestments a stark contrast against the polished wood. His expression remained calm, though his eyes sharpened. This service is hereby suspended, Harlan continued. Everyone needs to clear the property immediately. Father Elijah looked at his congregation, families with children in Easter clothes, elderly members who'd struggled to attend, newcomers who'd found safety within these walls. He spoke with quiet dignity. Officer, this is a holy service on the most sacred day of our calendar. You may wait outside until worship concludes. We'll be happy to address any concerns afterward. Harlan's face reddened. That sounds like defiance to me, Father. He spat the title like an insult. You've been warned about these illegal gatherings. This church has become a nuisance property, harboring vagrants. Those vagrants are our brothers and sisters, Father Elijah replied, voice steady. They have names. They have dignity. They deserve to celebrate Easter, too. Lena Boone rose from her pew near the front, her back straight as a rod. This is a house of worship, Officer Harlan. You have no right. Ma'am, sit down, or you'll be charged with interfering, Harlan snapped. From the side aisle, Miriam Vale stood up, her silver hair gleaming in the stained glass light. "Brett Harlan, I taught you in Sunday school when you were 8 years old. Your mother would be ashamed of this behavior in God's house." Harlan flinched, but quickly recovered. "This isn't about religion, Mrs. Vale. It's about law and order." Jamal Turner, sitting 3 rows back, slowly raised his phone and began recording. He kept his movements small, angling the device to capture both Harlan's aggressive stance and Father Elijah's dignified calm. Officer Pike shifted uncomfortably behind Harlan, eyes darting between his partner and the horrified congregation. "Officer," Father Elijah said, "I've spoken with the mayor about our Easter meal. We have served this community for decades. Hungry families are not a crime." "You were told to cancel it," Harlan shot back. "The council received complaints about loitering, sanitation risks, and improper use of church property." Father Elijah's voice remained steady. "No child is improper. No hungry person is a nuisance. And this property belongs to God, not to those who fear the poor." "That's it," Harlan stepped forward, grabbing Father Elijah's arm. "You're obstructing a police order and inciting disorder." The congregation erupted. An elderly deacon shouted, "Take your hands off him!" A young mother clutched her children. A silver tray of communion cups crashed to the floor as people surged forward in protest. "Pike, get over here and assist!" Harlan barked. Officer Pike hesitated, visibly uncomfortable, before moving forward with handcuffs. "Sir, please turn around," he said quietly to Father Elijah. Father Elijah looked at his frightened congregation. "Be at peace," he said. "Remember who you are." Then he turned and allowed Pike to place the handcuffs on his wrists. Children began crying. "Sos." Watkins, the 80-year-old choir director, shouted, "This is a disgrace before God." "One more word and you'll join him," Harlan threatened, pointing at her. Jamal kept recording, his hands trembling but steady enough to capture Harlan's reddened face, shouting while Father Elijah remained composed despite the handcuffs biting into his wrists. The stark contrast would become crucial evidence later. "You're making a mistake," Miriam Vale called out. "This town won't stand for this." "The town elected officials who are tired of this church acting above the law," Harlan retorted. "Your priest here thinks the rules don't apply to him." Father Elijah spoke clearly, each word measured. "I follow a higher law, Officer Harlan, one that commands us to love our neighbors, feed the hungry, and welcome the stranger." Harlan yanked him roughly toward the center aisle. "Save the sermon. You can explain your higher law downtown." The congregation watched in horror as their priest was marched down the aisle in handcuffs, his vestments catching on the pew corners, his head still held high. Lena pushed through the crowd, following close behind. "Elijah, I'm coming right behind you. Don't say anything until we get you a lawyer." Jamal Turner slipped away from his pew, clutching his phone. He knew what would happen next. They'd try to erase any evidence. Moving quickly, he ducked through a side door that led to the parish hall, his heart pounding against his ribs. Behind him, the sanctuary of St. Bartholomew's descended into chaos. Easter hymns replaced by shouts and weeping, joy transformed to outrage, peace shattered by the sound of a beloved priest being taken away in chains. The lawn outside St. Bartholomew's churned with confusion. Parishioners spilled from the sanctuary, some weeping, others shouting, all of them stunned by what they had just witnessed. Easter bonnets and pressed suits now seemed absurdly festive against the backdrop of their priest being hauled away in handcuffs. Lena Boone stood on the church steps, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Everyone, please, listen to me." Her military training showed in her stance, feet planted firmly, shoulders squared, voice projecting authority even as her hands trembled with rage. "They want us scattered and afraid," she called out. "That's not happening today. Not on Easter. Not at St. Bartholomew's." Across the lawn, Jamal Turner crouched behind a hedge near the fellowship hall, his back pressed against the brick wall. His fingers flew across his phone screen, uploading the video to 3 different places. If anyone tried to make him delete the footage, backups would already exist. Come on, he muttered, watching the progress bar crawl across his screen. His heart still hammered in his chest. He had seen what happened to evidence that made police look bad. It had a way of disappearing. Miriam Vale, meanwhile, had retreated to a quiet corner by the parish office. Her weathered hands gripped her phone as she scrolled through contacts accumulated over 7 decades in this town. "Martha? It's Miriam Vale. Yes, Easter blessings to you too. But I'm calling about something urgent. They've arrested Father Elijah. Right at the altar." She paused. "No, I'm not exaggerating. Call Judge Wilson. He attends your club, doesn't he?" She ended that call and immediately dialed again. "Robert? It's Miriam from St. Bartholomew's. Your father would turn in his grave if he knew what just happened in his church." Back on the steps, Lena divided the stunned congregation into groups. "The meal continues," she announced, pointing to the tables laden with Easter hams and casseroles. "Mrs. Washington, please take 4 people and make sure everyone gets fed. They want to scare away the hungry. We're not letting that happen." She turned to a group of deacons. "I need someone at the station now. Find out what they're charging him with." "It'll just be disturbing the peace or some nonsense," said Mr. Patterson, an elderly deacon. "They can't hold him on that. Not a respected priest." "They shouldn't have arrested him at all," Lena replied, her voice tight. "So let's not assume anything." Jamal emerged from his hiding spot, approaching an older man with a notepad who stood observing the scene from beneath an oak tree. Tobias Reed had covered town news for 30 years, long enough to recognize injustice when it unfolded before him. "Mr. Reed," Jamal said, "I got it all. The whole thing." He held out his phone. Tobias adjusted his glasses. "Show me." Together they watched the footage. Harlan's aggressive stance, Father Elijah's calm refusal to end the service, the moment when Harlan grabbed the priest's arm without provocation. "This doesn't make sense," Tobias muttered, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Easter Sunday? In front of children and grandmothers? Something else is happening here." "What do you mean?" Jamal asked. "Police don't just walk into a church during service, especially not on Easter, unless they're following orders from someone with pull." Tobias tapped his notepad. "Who benefits from humiliating Father Elijah today? Specifically? The mayor? Chief Doyle?" Jamal suggested. "Maybe. Or maybe whoever's been pushing to get the church's properties rezoned." Tobias pocketed his notepad. "I'm going to make some calls." By mid-afternoon, the mood had shifted from outrage to deep unease. Lena paced outside the police station, where a growing crowd of parishioners gathered. Deacon Patterson emerged from the building, his face ashen. "They won't let anyone see him," he reported. "Said he's still being processed." "For what?" Lena demanded. "It's been hours. This is a minor disturbance at worst." "They wouldn't tell me." Tobias Reed arrived at the station, moving quickly despite his age. He pulled Lena aside. "I just spoke to Carol at the courthouse," he said quietly. "Someone filed paperwork this morning before sunrise. Financial documents relating to St. Bartholomew's accounts and properties." "What?" Lena's stomach dropped. "What kind of paperwork?" "The kind that builds a fraud case," Tobias said grimly. "This wasn't some officer losing his temper, Lena. This arrest was planned. Someone wanted your brother in custody and the church in chaos today, specifically." "But why?" Lena began when her phone rang. She answered, listened, and the blood drained from her face. "That was the attorney I called," she told Tobias when she hung up. "They finally told him the charges." She took a deep breath. "Obstruction, resisting detention, and felony fraud involving the church housing funds." "Felony fraud?" Tobias repeated, disbelief etched on his face. "They're saying he misappropriated money meant for the shelter properties." Lena's voice cracked. "They're trying to destroy him, Tobias. Not just arrest him. They want to ruin everything he's built." Across the street, Officer Harlan emerged from the station doors, catching sight of the growing crowd. A satisfied smirk crossed his face before he turned away. "This isn't about Easter dinner permits," Lena said, her hands clenching into fists. "Someone wanted my brother gone, and they used that badge to do their dirty work." Easter evening settled over the town like a shroud. The bright morning that had begun with such promise now felt like a distant memory. Inside St. Bartholomew's church basement, fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Lena Boone surveyed the gathering before her. Church deacons, choir members, Sunday school teachers, and longtime parishioners filled every folding chair. Jamal Turner sat near the door, his phone in hand. Tobias Reed stood against the wall, notebook open. Miriam Vale occupied a chair near the front, her spine straight as a ruler despite her years. "They think we'll just go home and cry," Lena said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "They think we'll leave my brother alone in that cell while they drag his name through the dirt." "What exactly are they saying he did?" asked Mrs. Jenkins, the church treasurer, her hands trembling slightly. Tobias stepped forward. "The official charge is misappropriation of funds designated for the church housing properties. They're claiming he diverted money meant for repairs." "That's ridiculous," Mr. Patterson, a deacon, slapped his palm on the table. "Father Elijah lives like a monk. Where's this money supposed to have gone?" "It doesn't matter if it's true," Tobias replied. "What matters is they filed these documents yesterday, before Easter, before the arrest. This was planned." A heavy silence fell over the room. "They wanted to hurt him in public," Miriam said, her voice carrying despite its softness. "They chose Easter because it would cause the most pain, the most humiliation." Jamal held up his phone. "I've sent the video to everyone in our church directory. People are sharing it. You can see Harlan grab Father Elijah first. You can hear Father asking them to respect the worship service. The local stations won't touch it," Tobias added. "I called my contacts. They're running with the police statement about disrupting unauthorized gatherings and possible financial irregularities." Lena paced the length of the table. "We need to fight this on multiple fronts. Legal, public opinion, and community pressure." The church kitchen had transformed into an impromptu command center. Women who had prepared Easter dinner now made coffee and assembled sandwiches. The smell of leftover ham and potato casserole wafted through the basement. Someone had brought legal pads and pens, which were being passed around. "I've called Attorney Michaels," Lena continued. "He's trying to get bail set tonight, but they're dragging their feet." "I have more bad news," Tobias said quietly. "My source at City Hall says the town council has scheduled an emergency session for Tuesday. If these fraud accusations stick, they're considering putting church properties under temporary administrative control." The room erupted. "They can't do that. The church owns those buildings. What about the families living there?" Lena raised her hands for quiet. "This is bigger than just getting my brother out. They're coming for everything. The shelters, the food pantry, the housing units. All the things Father Elijah has built to help people no one else cares about." Miriam Vale stood up slowly, her arthritic hands gripping her purse. "I've been making calls," she announced. "People listen to an old lady who's buried 2 husbands in this town." A few nervous laughs rippled through the room. "There are plenty of folks who've never set foot in this church, but oh, Father Elijah, their dignity, or their sobriety, or even their lives." She opened a small notebook. "Robert Allen at the hardware store. Father sat with his son all night when the boy overdosed. Margaret Wilson. Father visited her husband every day for a month before he passed. Chief Taylor, who retired last year. Father counseled his daughter through divorce when nobody else would talk to her." "What are you suggesting?" Lena asked. "I'm suggesting," Miriam replied, "that there are more people in this town who love Father Elijah than there are people who fear Chief Doyle. They just need permission to say it out loud." Jamal stood up. "The video's being shared like crazy now. People from other churches are messaging me, asking what they can do. We need to be visible, Lena decided. Not just online, but in person. They want us to be ashamed, to hide, to whisper. We need to stand in the light. A vigil? Suggested Mrs. Jenkins. More than a vigil, Tobias said. A demand, a public reckoning. The planning continued as midnight approached. Lists were made. Who would bring chairs? Who would coordinate rides for elderly members? Who would contact other churches? The basement hummed with purpose, fear, transforming into resolve. At 12:30, Lena stood at the center of the room. Call everyone you know. Tell them to be at the police station at sunrise. Not to yell, not to threaten, but to be seen. To show them that Father Elijah doesn't stand alone. Miriam began the phone tree, her voice steady as she dialed the first number. Jamal drafted a simple message to spread through social media. Stand for Father Elijah. Police station, sunrise. By 1 in the morning, the word was spreading from house to house, phone to phone, message to message. The town that had watched a priest led away in handcuffs would watch something else entirely when the sun rose again. Bring your Bibles, Miriam told each person she called. Bring your hymn books. Bring your children. Let them see what faith really looks like. As they finally prepared to leave the church, exhausted but determined, Tobias paused at the door. You know they'll try to paint this as a disturbance, he warned. Let them, Lena replied, her eyes bright with unshed tears and fierce determination. Let them try to explain why half the town showed up for a man they call a criminal. Dawn broke over Main Street with a pale gold light. The shadows retreated as people emerged from side streets, parking lots, and carpools. They came in steady streams, first a dozen, then 50, then hundreds, converging on the police station with quiet determination. Lena Boone arrived at 6:15 a.m., expecting to find a small gathering of loyal parishioners. Instead, she stopped mid-stride, her hand flying to her mouth. The street was filling with faces, not just the Sunday regulars from St. Bartholomew's pews. There were mechanics in work shirts with their names stitched above the pocket, elementary school teachers who'd taught half the town to read, veterans in caps bearing unit insignia, widows who rarely left their homes, young families with children bundled against the morning chill. They carried folding chairs, thermoses of coffee, and platters of food covered in tin foil. Some held Bibles. Others carried signs with simple messages, Free Father Elijah, and Justice for Saint Bart's, and We Stand with the Truth. Most striking of all was a sea of Easter lilies and spring flowers placed at the station steps, transforming the entrance into an impromptu altar. I didn't know, Lena whispered, her voice faltering. Mrs. Jenkins appeared at her side. This is what he built, she said simply. Not just a church, a community. Near the front of the gathering, Miriam Vale stood ramrod straight, despite her 70 years, greeting people with handshakes and quiet nods. She wore her best Sunday dress and a hat with netting, as proper as if attending Easter service. Harold Wilson, she said, clasping the hand of a man in faded overalls. Haven't seen you in church since your wife's funeral. Been 10 years, he admitted, looking down. But Father Elijah sat with me that whole night when Lucy passed. I ain't forgotten. And Sylvia Thompson, Miriam continued, turning to a black woman who taught 3rd grade. I believe we were on opposite sides at the school board meeting last fall. That doesn't matter today, Sylvia replied firmly. Jamal moved through the crowd with his phone held high, documenting the gathering. This is real, he kept saying. Everyone needs to see this is real. Tobias Reed stood on the edge, notebook in hand, his reporter's eye cataloging details that defied the town's usual segregation. Black residents from the east side stood shoulder to shoulder with working-class whites from the factory district. Elderly white women from the garden club passed water bottles to young Latino men who worked construction. The town's neat social boundaries had dissolved overnight. They've never assembled like this, Tobias murmured to Lena. Not for a parade, not for a football championship, not even after the mill closed. The protest maintained a disciplined air. No one shouted or pushed. When someone attempted to start a hostile chant, Miriam stepped in immediately. "We are not here to threaten," she corrected firmly. "We are here to witness." Instead, the church choir women gathered in a loose circle on the sidewalk and began singing "Amazing Grace." The melody floated up, joined voice by voice until it filled the square with sound. Inside the station, behind blinds and locked doors, Father Elijah sat in a holding cell, unable to see the gathering outside. But he noticed officers moving nervously, checking windows, making calls. A young desk officer finally approached his cell. "There are people outside," he told Elijah, his voice low. "A lot of people." "How many?" Elijah asked. The officer hesitated. "The whole town, it looks like." Elijah closed his eyes, overwhelmed. All night he had prayed not for himself but for his congregation, that they would not be scattered by fear, that they would remember their own strength. He had not dared hope for this. At 8:30 a.m. the station doors opened. Chief Raymond Doyle emerged in full uniform, his silver badge catching the morning light. The crowd fell quiet, a hush sweeping through hundreds of people. Doyle surveyed the assembly, his face a mask of professional neutrality. When he spoke, his voice carried through the portable microphone he held. "I understand your concern for Father Boone," he began. "However, this department has a duty to investigate serious allegations. Our Financial Crimes Unit has uncovered evidence suggesting years of misconduct involving church funds and donations." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd. Lena stepped forward, but Miriam placed a restraining hand on her arm. "Let him finish," she whispered. "Let everyone hear what they're truly claiming." Doyle continued, his tone regretful but firm. "Father Boone will not be released today. The investigation must proceed according to protocol. We have a responsibility to protect public resources and charitable funds." Then came the knife twist, delivered with practiced concern. "I must also inform you that the town council has scheduled an emergency session to consider temporary receivership of church properties until this matter is resolved. This would be a protective measure only to ensure assets are preserved." A stunned silence fell over the crowd. What had seemed a simple injustice, a beloved priest unfairly detained, suddenly revealed itself as something far larger. Not just Elijah's freedom hung in the balance, but the church itself, the buildings, the land, the shelters and housing units that served the town's most vulnerable. Lena's face drained of color. Jamal lowered his phone. Miriam Vale's hand tightened on her purse strap. The line had been drawn, not in sand, but in stone. An hour after Doyle's announcement, the church basement hummed with urgent voices and shuffling papers. Metal folding chairs scraped against the linoleum floor as Lena Boone stood at the head of a long table, her nurse's posture ramrod straight, her eyes sharp with purpose. Outside, the protest continued in shifts, but here, in this fluorescent-lit room with its cinder-block walls, the real fight was taking shape. "We need to be smarter than anger," Lena said, looking at the faces gathered around her. "They're counting on us to get tired or scared or both." Tobias Reed sat with the reporter's notebook open, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he wrote. Jamal Turner had his laptop open, thumbnail images of his Easter video visible on screen. Miriam Vale, elegant even in her distress, kept her cell phone close, the contact list of Pine Ridge's oldest families at her fingertips. "We split this into fronts," Lena continued, writing on the chalkboard usually reserved for Sunday school lessons. "Like a military operation, each with clear objectives." She turned and pointed at Tobias. "You're our investigator. We need the fraud trail documented and the land records pulled. There's something bigger happening with the church property." Tobias nodded, rubbing his jaw. "I've got contacts at the county recorder's office, and I know which clerks can't be bought." "Jamal," Lena said next, "your job is evidence. That video saved us from their first lie. Every image, every recording, Protect it. Copy it. Get it to people who matter. Jamal's fingers moved swiftly across his keyboard. I've got 3 backups already. And I'm building a timeline of everything that happened, minute by minute. Lena turned to Miriam. You know people I can't reach. People who hide behind respectability and good manners while injustice happens. Miriam's lips thinned. I've started already. Called Judge Whitaker's widow this morning. Her husband and Elijah prayed together when the cancer came. She'll speak to her son-in-law on the council. The basement door opened, and a young mother poked her head in. The meal station needs more bread. Police are watching people who come for food. They want the vulnerable to disappear, Lena said. Keep those tables full. We won't let them win by hunger. As volunteers rushed to restock supplies, a church elder turned on the small television kept in the corner for children's movies. The local news was running footage of the Easter arrest, but something was wrong. They'd edited out Harlan's aggression, showing only the moment when parishioners surged forward. Look at this, someone hissed. They're making it look like we started it. The anchor's voice was somber. Police sources describe a chaotic scene during what should have been a routine code enforcement. Jamal slammed his laptop shut. That's a straight-up lie. I've got the full video right here. They're counting on people seeing their version first, Tobias said grimly. Classic control tactic. Lena's phone buzzed. She answered, listened, then covered the mouthpiece. It's Marina from the bakery. Health inspectors just showed up. 3rd business that donated food to us today. The room fell quiet as the magnitude of the pressure became clear. This wasn't just about Elijah anymore. It was a coordinated campaign to isolate them. They're targeting anyone who helps us, Tobias confirmed. Got a text from Doug at the print shop. Fire marshal showed up right after he made our flyers. A volunteer rushed in, breathless. There's a patrol car parked outside the church now. Just sitting there, watching people come and go. Taking pictures of license plates, probably, Tobias said. Lena straightened her shoulders. This is what bullies do. They make the price of standing up feel too high for ordinary people. People are already asking if they should still come to the protest, a deacon admitted. They've got kids, jobs. That's exactly what they want, Miriam said, her voice cutting through the worry. Fear is their weapon. Always has been. As evening approached, the basement slowly emptied as people headed back to the protest or home to families. Lena remained, surrounded by financial folders and church records. You should rest, Tobias told her, pausing at the door. After I understand what they're really after, she replied. When the room finally emptied, Lena opened a drawer marked Housing Trust and began sorting through files. She found mortgage documents she'd never seen before, dated 6 months earlier. Her breath caught. Under the harsh fluorescent light, Lena stared at her brother's signature. Elijah had taken out a second mortgage on the rectory, his own residence, without telling anyone. The attached banknote explained why. When the contractor disappeared with repair funds, the church housing units faced closure. Building inspectors had demanded immediate fixes or eviction of 30 families. Rather than displace them, Elijah had leveraged his own home. "Oh, Elijah," she whispered, touching the paper where his name was signed. The document trembled in her hand. This was what they would twist, his sacrifice into something suspicious. A private act of protection that, without context, could look like financial irregularity. Outside the basement window, a police cruiser's lights flashed briefly, illuminating the empty church lawn in red and blue. The warning couldn't have been clearer if they'd painted it on the walls. That same evening, rain began to fall outside the rectory windows, gentle at first, then harder, drumming against the glass. Inside Elijah's office, Lena spread the mortgage documents across his desk while Tobias and the church bookkeeper, Mrs. Winters, leaned in to examine them. The police cruiser's headlights swept across the room as it circled the block again. Its third pass in an hour. They're not even trying to be subtle, Lena muttered, pushing a strand of hair from her face. Mrs. Winters adjusted her reading glasses, her fingers trembling slightly as she sorted through the papers. She was a thin woman in her 60s who'd managed the church finances for over 15 years. "I didn't know about this second mortgage," she admitted. "Father Elijah handled it personally." Tobias picked up the bank statements. $130,000. All of it transferred directly to Landmark Construction for emergency repairs. "The timing matches when our regular contractor disappeared with the advance payment," Mrs. Winters confirmed. "Building inspectors gave us 10 days to fix structural issues or vacate 30 families." Lena's jaw tightened. "So my brother put up his own home rather than see those people homeless?" "Yes," Mrs. Winters nodded. "But he never told the parish council. He just solved it." Tobias shook his head. "Which is exactly how they'll twist this. A secret financial move, documents signed without oversight." "It wasn't theft," Lena insisted. "It was sacrifice." "Sometimes those look the same on paper," Tobias replied gently. "Especially when someone wants them to." The office door opened, and Jamal stepped in, his jacket soaked from the rain. His eyes were red-rimmed from exhaustion, but there was a hardness there that hadn't been present before Easter. "How's the protest holding up?" Lena asked. "Still strong. About 40 people rotating in shifts." He slumped into a chair. "But something happened on my way back here." "What?" Tobias asked sharply. "Two officers stopped me outside the diner. Asked to see my phone." Jamal's voice was flat, controlled. "They said I should delete the Easter video if I know what's good for me. Said it would be a shame if old warrants from my neighborhood suddenly needed attention." Lena stood up so quickly her chair nearly toppled. "They threatened you." "Not in words that would stand up in court," Jamal said with bitter maturity beyond his 19 years. The phone rang, startling everyone. Mrs. Winters answered it, listened briefly, then handed it to Lena. "It's Miriam," she said. Lena took the call, her face growing grimmer by the second. When she hung up, she turned to the others. "Miriam's been making calls all evening. She says half the town is terrified but furious. People who've never spoken up before want to help, but they're getting warnings too. The hardware store owner who donated plywood for signs? His delivery trucks are being stopped for random inspections." Tobias stood, gathering his notebook. "I need to follow something. A clerk at Planning and Zoning mentioned unusual activity around church properties. I was going to check tomorrow, but after this—" "Go now," Lena urged. "I'll keep working through these documents." As Tobias left, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows like impatient fingers. Jamal helped Mrs. Winters organize receipts, showing exactly where the mortgage money had gone. Every dollar accounted for in repairs that kept families housed. "Has anyone told Father Elijah about what we've found?" Mrs. Winters asked. Lena shook her head. "They're limiting his calls. He knows we're fighting, but not the details." "What's he doing in there?" Jamal asked. "Being Elijah," Lena replied with a sad smile. "The guard who owed him a favor said he's spending the night praying with some Vietnam vet in the drunk tank. Man lost his grandson last year. Elijah counseled the family. Even locked up, he's still—" Jamal trailed off. "Still himself," Lena finished. "That's what scares them." 3 hours later, near midnight, rain still pounded the streets as Tobias hurried back into the rectory, his coat dripping onto the floor. His eyes were wide with discovery, and he clutched a folder against his chest to protect it from the rain. "I found it," he said, spreading damp papers across Elijah's desk. It wasn't just about the Easter meal or Elijah's outspokenness. It's about the land. Lena and Jamal crowded around as Tobias pointed to redevelopment committee minutes marked "closed session." "I had to call in favors from a clerk who owed me," Tobias explained. "These records show Celia Mercer has been working through 3 different shell companies to acquire properties around St. Bartholomew's." "Celia Mercer?" Lena frowned. "The developer? The one always in society photos, cutting ribbons?" "The very one," Tobias confirmed. "She's been quietly assembling parcels for a luxury development. The church block is the last piece she needs." "But the church isn't for sale," Jamal said. "Exactly." And when Elijah found out some parishioners were being pressured to sell their homes, he announced that sermon series on who profits when the poor are displaced. Tobias tapped a highlighted section of the minutes. Look at the date. 2 weeks before Easter, Mercer told the committee she had obstacles to remove before the final vote. Lena's fingers tightened on the edge of the desk. My brother was the obstacle. There's more, Tobias said, flipping to another page. The emergency safety complaints used to justify the Easter raid, filed by a property management firm connected to Mercer's development group. Jamal stared at the documents, the truth dawning in his eyes. They didn't arrest Father Elijah because of racism or because he was feeding homeless people. No, Tobias said grimly, though those biases made him an easier target. They arrested him because he stood between Celia Mercer and millions in development profit. The fraud case is just the tool. Through the window, they could see the police cruiser still parked across the street, its presence a constant reminder of the power aligned against them. But now, at least, they understood why. The corner booth at Mabel's Diner had been their spot for years, where parish council met when heating bills ran high, where Elijah counseled troubled teens over pie and coffee. Now, in the gray pre-dawn light, it became a war room. Tobias slid into the cracked vinyl seat beside Miriam, placing a manila folder on the table between coffee mugs and syrup-sticky menus. His eyes were rimmed red from a night without sleep. I made copies of everything, he said, voice low despite the empty diner. Originals locked in my desk at the paper. Lena nodded, watching the street outside for unwelcome faces. Across from her, Jamal slumped against the window, eyes half closed. The boy had been up all night, monitoring social media responses to his Easter video, deleting threats, saving evidence. Eat something, Lena told him, pushing a plate of untouched toast his way. We need you thinking straight. Miriam poured more coffee from the carafe. Let's see what we're dealing with. Tobias spread several pages across the table, keeping them away from spills. These are complaints filed with code enforcement against St. Bartholomew's properties. Look at the dates. 3 separate reports in the 2 weeks before Easter, all claiming overcrowding, unsafe conditions, unauthorized use. That's garbage, Lena said. Our buildings pass every inspection. Exactly. But the complaints triggered the emergency that Harlan used to justify entering during Mass. Tobias tapped a highlighted name at the bottom of one form. Filed by Westfield Property Management. Never heard of them, Miriam said. You wouldn't. They're a shell company. But trace the paperwork back, and they're owned by Ridgeline Partners, which is controlled by Celia Mercer's development group. Tobias slid another document forward. And here's where it gets interesting. Mercer's group has acquired 7 properties surrounding the church block in the last 18 months. Lena stared at the map Tobias had marked. Red X surrounding St. Bartholomew's like a noose. They're boxing us in, she whispered. The church isn't just a church, Tobias continued. It owns the food pantry building, the transitional housing units, and that corner lot where the youth center was planned. Together with the sanctuary, it's nearly a full city block. The last holdout in what Mercer's planning documents call the Marigold District redevelopment. Jamal finally spoke, his voice thick with fatigue. Luxury condos. That's what this is about? They locked up Father Elijah for condos? For millions in development profit, Tobias corrected. The zoning vote next month would fast-track Mercer's project if the whole block is under unified ownership. With Elijah gone and the church finances frozen under fraud accusations, the diocese might sell to make the scandal go away, Lena finished, the realization like ice in her stomach. Miriam studied the donor list Tobias had compiled. Her lips thinned as she recognized names. Douglas Whittier, Margaret Benson, the Caldwell Foundation. She tapped each one. Old money. People who'd never publicly support what happened to Elijah, but who've invested in Mercer's previous developments. They sit on hospital boards with me, serve at the country club, host charity events. Would they know about framing a priest? Lena asked, They wouldn't ask questions about unfortunate obstacles being removed, Miriam said. That's how power works in this town. Clean hands, dirty results. The waitress refilled their cups. When she'd gone, Jamal pulled out his phone. The local stations are still ignoring my video, he said. They keep showing clips that make Father Elijah look aggressive. I'm sending the full footage to some bigger accounts. My cousin works at a regional news site. They're not tied to local advertisers. Good, Lena said. We need outside eyes on this. This explains why Doyle sounded so prepared, Lena realized, staring into her coffee. The whole thing, the Easter timing, the public humiliation, the fraud charges. It was choreographed. Make an example of the troublemaker priest before the zoning vote. The morning stretched into afternoon. They separated to cover more ground. Lena to coordinate the ongoing station protest, Miriam to quietly question reluctant church council members about pressure they'd received, Tobias to dig deeper into property records, and Jamal to amplify the video evidence. By 4 o'clock, something shifted. Jamal's footage, now spreading through regional news sites, was drawing uncomfortable questions. The stark image of a black priest in Easter vestments being handcuffed at the altar had finally broken through. Lena was distributing water to protesters outside the station when her phone rang. A number she didn't recognize. Ms. Boone, my name is Sarah. I work at First Community Hospital with Officer Pike's wife. The woman's voice was tense, fearful. Nolan asked me to call you. He wants to talk. About what? Lena asked, stepping away from the crowd. About your brother. About what happened at the church. He says things weren't right. The department had those fraud documents before they ever went into the church on Easter. Lena's heart hammered. Why is he telling me this? He can't sleep. He's been sick since it happened. The woman paused. Nolan's not like Harlan. He has kids that go to the youth programs at St. Bartholomew's. As dusk gathered over the town, turning shop windows to mirrors, Lena waited in her car behind the public library. Her phone lit up with a text. Parking now. Black sedan. A car pulled alongside hers, and Officer Nolan Pike stepped out, not in uniform, but in jeans and a plain shirt. His face was drawn, shoulders hunched against Discovery. I shouldn't be here, he said, sliding into her passenger seat. If Doyle finds out. But you are here, Lena replied. Why? Pike stared straight ahead through the windshield. Because what they did to Father Elijah wasn't right. It wasn't about safety violations or church finances. He turned to face her, guilt etched in the lines around his eyes. Harlan told me the night before Easter that we were going to make an example of the priest. Said it would help clear things up before the zoning vote. I didn't understand what he meant then, but I do now. You have proof? Lena asked. Pike nodded slowly. I can confirm the department had those fraud documents in hand before we ever set foot in the church. The whole thing was staged. They wanted him arrested in front of everyone. Maximum humiliation. The old feed store on Mason Street had been closed for years, its windows covered with brown paper, a forgotten relic from when the town still had working farms nearby. Lena pulled her car around back where the loading dock offered privacy from the street. Tobias was already waiting, hands deep in his coat pockets against the evening chill. He's coming? Tobias asked as Lena stepped out. She nodded. 10 minutes. Jamal's watching the corner. Across the empty lot, Jamal Turner paced near his car, hood pulled up, eyes scanning for cruisers. The 19-year-old looked older tonight, shoulders tense, movements careful. He'd been checking mirrors all day, ever since officers had suggested he delete his video. The back door's lock had been jimmied long ago by teenagers. Tobias pushed it open with a squeak of rusty hinges. Inside, the storage room smelled of dust and forgotten grain. Lena clicked on a battery lantern she'd brought, casting weird shadows across stacked pallets and empty shelves. This feels like a spy movie, Tobias muttered, setting his recorder on an upturned crate. It feels dangerous, Lena replied. For him, especially. Headlights swept the back lot. Jamal's text came seconds later. It's Pike. Alone. Officer Nolan Pike entered like a man expecting ambush, eyes darting to corners before settling on Lena and Tobias. Without his uniform, in just jeans and a navy sweatshirt, he looked smaller, younger. "I can't stay long," Pike said, remaining near the door. "Harlan's been watching who talks to who." Tobias pressed record. "Tell us exactly what happened before Easter." Pike's hands wouldn't stay still. "Harlan was bragging in the locker room Saturday night. Said the preacher would be in bracelets by noon on Easter. I thought he was just talking trash until Doyle pulled us in for a special briefing." "Chief Doyle was there?" Lena leaned forward. "Yeah. He said we had credible reports about safety violations at St. Bartholomew's. Said the timing was important. His exact words. They handed us those fraud documents before we ever stepped foot in the church." Tobias frowned. "So the department received financial accusations before any formal audit?" Pike nodded. "They were waiting for us that morning. Doyle said Father Boone needed to be—" he winced at the memory— broken in public before he could rally opposition to some deal. I didn't know what deal he meant then. "Mercer's development," Lena said flatly. "I guess so." Pike ran a hand through his hair. "Look, I'm not saying I'm innocent here. I put the cuffs on him, but it wasn't supposed to go down like that. We were told it would be quick and quiet." Lena's eyes hardened. "There's nothing quiet about arresting a priest during Easter Mass." "I know that now." Shame colored Pike's voice. "When Harlan grabbed him at the altar, I just followed procedure. But seeing those old ladies crying, kids screaming—" He shook his head. "It wasn't right." Outside, Jamal's text pinged again. "Still clear. Video just hit Channel 9. Tobias checked his phone. "The full video's spreading. Regional stations are picking it up." Lena turned back to Pike. "Will you testify to this? Officially?" The question hung in the air. Pike stared at his hands. "I have a mortgage. 2 kids." His voice dropped. "But I haven't slept since Easter. Every time I close my eyes, I see Father Boone's face when Harlan yanked him away from the altar." "Doyle will bury this without your statement," Tobias said. Pike nodded slowly. "I'll write it down. Everything. But I can't promise I won't get scared later." The honesty was strangely reassuring. Lena handed him a notebook. As Pike wrote, Jamal slipped inside, bringing the smell of night air. "It's everywhere now," he whispered, showing Lena his phone. The video was unmistakable. Father Elijah's dignity amid chaos, Harlan's aggression, the silver communion cups scattering like wind chimes. Viewers across 3 counties were sharing it, commenting, demanding answers. By morning, public opinion had shifted like a tide. The mayor's office released a statement before noon. Mayor Evelyn Price has ordered an immediate internal review of the Easter arrest at St. Bartholomew's Church. While investigations continue, Father Elijah Boone will be released pending further proceedings. Lena was at the station when they brought Elijah out. 4 days of detention had left shadows under his eyes and a careful stiffness to his movements. But he walked upright, head unbowed. The bruise on his cheekbone only made him look more dignified, more wronged. The crowd that had maintained its vigil erupted. Hundreds of voices called his name. Church members wept. Even strangers who'd only seen the video cheered from parking lots across the street. Elijah stopped at the top of the station steps, momentarily overwhelmed by the sea of faces. The crowd parted for him like a procession as he descended. Hands reached to touch his shoulders, his arms. Children were lifted up for blessings. Lena pushed through to reach him, and when she did, the emotion on her face spoke more than words. "They were waiting for you," she said, voice thick. "All of them. The whole town." Elijah embraced his sister, then raised his hand to quiet the crowd. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying across the square. "Thank you for your witness." What struck Tobias, watching from nearby, was what Elijah didn't do. He didn't shake his fist, didn't demand revenge, didn't feed the anger still simmering in the crowd. Instead, he offered blessings, asked after people's health, thanked them for their courage. It only made them love him more. That evening, St. Bartholomew's was packed beyond capacity. People stood along walls, sat on steps, spilled onto the lawn where speakers had been hastily set up. Elijah, back in his vestments, moved carefully to the pulpit. "Today feels like victory," he began, his voice stronger than his body looked. "But we must be ready, my friends." The church fell silent, hanging on his words. People who use power this way, who would humiliate a man of God at his altar, who would threaten the hungry to seize land, such people rarely surrender after the first blow. Only a few hours after the prayer service, the night air hung heavy with exhaustion and relief. Elijah Boone sat in his rectory office, the lamplight casting long shadows across the walls. His body ached from days in a cell, but being home felt like resurrection itself. Lena perched on the edge of his desk, watching him with careful eyes. "You should rest," she said. "Soon," Elijah promised, his fingers tracing the worn wood of his desk. "I just want to sit here a moment longer. Breathe the air of this place." The siblings fell into comfortable silence. After 4 days of chaos, this quiet felt sacred. Then the peace shattered. The church bells began clanging, not the measured toll of worship, but the frantic, irregular peals of alarm. Elijah stood so quickly, his chair crashed backward. "Fire!" Lena whispered, already rushing toward the door. They burst outside to a nightmare. Thick black smoke poured from the parish records annex, the small building connected to the church where decades of documents were stored. Orange flames licked at the windows, casting hellish light across the church grounds. "Call 911!" Elijah shouted to someone, anyone, as he ran toward the burning building. Volunteers emerged from nearby homes, parishioners who'd stayed close after the service. Jamal sprinted from across the street where he'd been keeping watch. Miriam's car screeched to a halt at the curb. "The records!" Lena cried out, her voice breaking. Everyone understood immediately what was burning. The deeds to church properties, the donor ledgers, renovation contracts, financial histories, the very documents that could prove Elijah's innocence. Jamal grabbed a garden hose, while 2 men from the congregation tried forcing the annex door. The heat pushed them back. Sirens wailed in the distance. "Don't get too close," Elijah yelled, pulling Jamal away from the worst of the smoke. Firefighters arrived within minutes, but the damage was already devastating. Water soaked what flames hadn't already consumed. Thick smoke turned paper to ash. The sanctuary itself was spared. The fire hadn't jumped to the main church, but the records were another matter. Tobias Reed arrived, breathless, as police cruisers surrounded the scene with suspicious efficiency. The reporter's eyes narrowed when he saw Officer Harlan stringing yellow tape before the fire was even fully extinguished. "They got here awful fast," he muttered to Lena. By dawn, the fire was out, leaving behind soggy ash and charred filing cabinets. Elijah stood in silent devastation, watching investigators move through the ruins of the annex. His face, lit by the rising sun, showed the weight of understanding that fell upon him. Chief Raymond Doyle arrived just after sunrise. His polished shoes crunched across wet debris as he approached the gathered crowd with performative solemnity. "This is a tragic development," Doyle announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Initial investigation suggests the fire may have been deliberately set to destroy financial evidence related to our ongoing case. The implication hung in the air like the lingering smoke. Elijah or his supporters had torched their own church to hide proof of wrongdoing." Lena stepped forward, fury blazing in her eyes. "That's absurd. These records would have cleared my brother's name." "We follow evidence, Ms. Boone, not assumptions," Doyle replied coldly. "The timing is certainly convenient." The emotional whiplash hit the community like a physical blow. Yesterday's jubilation at Elijah's release twisted into fresh suspicion. Jamal approached Tobias, his voice low. "Pike won't answer my calls. Something's wrong." Later that morning, Their fears were confirmed. Officer Nolan Pike sent a terse message through an intermediary. He was retracting his statement. He would not testify about the planned nature of the Easter arrest. "They got to him," Tobias said grimly, deleting the message after showing it to Lena. "Threatened his career, probably worse." The setbacks multiplied like wounds. Tobias tried accessing municipal archive duplicates of the redevelopment plans, records that might still prove the conspiracy, but the mayor's office blocked him. "I'm sorry, Mr. Reed," Mayor Price's assistant explained with rehearsed regret. "Those documents require proper authorization during an ongoing investigation. Procedure, you understand." The final betrayal came that afternoon. The bishop arrived at St. Bartholomew's, his black car gleaming in the sunlight. He requested a private meeting with Elijah while Lena waited outside, pacing like a sentinel. When Elijah emerged 30 minutes later, his face was ashen. "He wants me to step aside," he said quietly, when they were alone in the sanctuary. "For the good of the diocese." "He can't do that," Lena's voice echoed against the high ceiling. "He can. He believes the situation has become too volatile." Elijah sank into a pew. He fears scandal more than injustice. Outside, cleanup crews worked in the annex ruins. Inside, the stained glass cast colored light across the empty altar where, less than a week ago, Elijah had been humiliated in handcuffs. After sunset, the church fell into darkness. The siblings sat alone in the silent sanctuary, illuminated only by a single candle. "I've always believed," Elijah finally said, his voice barely audible, "that innocence would protect us in the end. That truth would find its way to light." Lena took her brother's hand. "And now?" Elijah looked at her, his eyes reflecting the candle's flame. "Innocence will not save us unless the truth is forced into daylight. We have been too patient with evil, too trusting in systems that were never built to protect people like us." The candle flickered between them, a small defiant light in the darkness of betrayal. The morning after the fire, the scent of smoke still hung in the air. Soot particles floated in the sunbeams that cut through the stained glass windows of St. Bartholomew's. The sanctuary was quiet except for the distant sound of cleanup crews working in the damaged annex next door. Lena Boone pushed open the heavy wooden door and found her brother exactly where she'd left him the night before. Father Elijah sat in the front pew, his posture straight despite his exhaustion, eyes fixed on the altar. "You didn't sleep," Lena said. It wasn't a question. Elijah turned slightly. His clerical collar stood stark white against his dark skin, the only thing about him that looked fresh. "I did more useful things than sleep." "Like what?" "Planning. Praying." He rose slowly, stretching muscles stiff from sitting all night. "Remembering who we are." Lena crossed her arms. "And who are we, exactly?" "The people the bishop just abandoned. The ones with our buildings burning and our names being dragged through dirt. We're the ones who are done playing defense." Something had shifted in Elijah's voice. The weariness remained, but underneath it lay steel. Within the hour, Tobias Reed arrived, notepad already in hand. Jamal Turner followed, eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, but alert. Miriam Vale came last, her silver hair pulled back severely, wearing a tailored gray suit that meant business. They gathered in the undamaged side chapel, away from the workers and the lingering smoke. "We've been making a mistake," Elijah said without preamble. "We've been responding to each attack one by one. The arrest, the fraud claims, the fire. We defend, explain, recover, and then they hit us again." Tobias nodded. "They control the pace." "Exactly." Elijah planted both hands on the small table between them. "We need to expose the entire machine at once. The land grab, the staged arrest, the smear campaign, the fire. All connected, all deliberate. But our evidence keeps disappearing," Jamal pointed out. "Pike backing out, the records burning." "Which means we find new evidence," Lena interrupted. "From sources they haven't reached yet." Elijah looked at each of them in turn. "The emergency council meeting is tomorrow. If we arrive with just our outrage, We lose. We need proof that cannot be dismissed. Miriam straightened in her chair. I know several people from the old families who still value their reputations above all else. People who fear public scandal more than they fear private wrongdoing. Go to them, Elijah urged. Make them understand silence is no longer the safe choice. I'll create a timeline, Tobias said, already scribbling notes. Every complaint filed, every document submitted, every property move around the church block. When we lay it all out, the pattern becomes obvious. Jamal leaned forward. What about me? The station, Elijah replied. There must be people inside who've seen things, heard things. Not every officer thinks like Harlan or Doyle. And there are dispatchers, clerks, janitors, people who notice everything, but are rarely noticed themselves. Lena tapped her fingers on the table. I'll gather witnesses, tenants from the church housing, veterans you've counseled, the parish bookkeepers, everyone who can explain those so-called financial irregularities. 4 paths, 1 destination, Elijah said. When we walk into that council meeting, we need to be carrying truth too heavy for them to lift. They dispersed quickly after that, aware of how little time remained. Tobias headed to the county records office where a former student worked the front desk. Jamal began making calls to protesters who had maintained vigil at the station, asking what they'd observed. Lena drove to the church apartments to speak with residents. Miriam lingered behind. Those trust documents you mentioned, she said to Elijah. The ones showing the church properties were placed in protected charitable status decades ago? Elijah nodded. They existed in the annex, but now... My late husband's law partner might have copies, Miriam said. Harold Whitman. He's 93 and semi-retired, but his memory is sharp as ever. He handled half the property matters in this town from 1960 to 2010. Would he help us? Elijah asked. Miriam's lips curved in a slight smile. Harold and I have history. He owes me several favors, and I've never collected. Until now. By early afternoon, they had each made initial progress. Jamal found 3 protesters who had seen Harlan arrive early on Easter morning, hours before the service, already in a combative mood. Tobias discovered a pattern of targeted code complaints against properties adjacent to church land, all filed within days of Elijah's public opposition to the redevelopment plan. Lena met with the church bookkeeper, who had kept unofficial duplicate records at home. Just in case, she'd said with a pointed look. These showed clearly that every penny Elijah borrowed against the rectory had gone directly to emergency housing repairs after a contractor disappeared with advance payments. At 3 o'clock, Miriam stood in the church parking lot, car keys in hand. She wore pearl earrings and carried a leather portfolio filled with old photographs and newspaper clippings from her husband's estate. Harold Whitman is a creature of habit, she told Elijah. He still takes afternoon tea at exactly 4. I'll be joining him uninvited. What if he refuses to help? Lena asked. Miriam's smile tightened. Then I'll remind him that his good name rests on very selective memories about who really funded his firm's expansion in 1978. The truth can be inconvenient for everyone, not just us. She drove away, determination in every line of her posture, leaving the others to continue building their case, piece by fragile piece. The April sun cast long shadows as Miriam Vale parked her Buick in front of Whitman and Associates. The small law office occupied the same Victorian building since 1951, its brass doorplate polished to a shine that belied the dusty practices within. She smoothed her skirt, clutched her portfolio, and walked in with the confidence of someone who belonged. The receptionist, a young woman who clearly didn't recognize Miriam's social standing, looked up with mild surprise. "Do you have an appointment with Mr. Whitman?" "I don't need one," Miriam replied. "Harold and I go back 50 years. Tell him Miriam Vale is here for tea." Inside his wood-paneled office, Harold Whitman sat behind a massive oak desk. At 93, he remained sharp-featured and alert, though his hands trembled slightly as he set down his teacup. "Miriam," he said, not rising, "this is unexpected." She settled into the leather chair across from him without waiting for an invitation. "I'm sure you've heard about Father Elijah and St. E. Bartholomew's." Harold's face tightened. "Unfortunate business." "It's not unfortunate, Harold. It's criminal." Miriam opened her portfolio and placed a yellowed newspaper clipping on his desk. "Remember this? 1978. The expansion of your firm after that big insurance settlement." Harold glanced at the photo showing himself, Miriam's husband, and several prominent businessmen at a ribbon cutting. Ancient history. "Not to me. Not when my Robert told me where that money really came from before he died." Her voice remained level, but her eyes hardened. "I've kept quiet for decades out of respect. But now I need something in return." Harold shifted uncomfortably. "What exactly do you want?" "The church trust documents from 1967. The ones establishing protected charitable status for St. Bartholomew's properties." His expression didn't change, but his fingers tapped nervously on the desk. "Those would be confidential." Miriam leaned forward. "Don't hide behind confidentiality when we both know what's happening. They're burning that man's reputation and trying to steal land that legally cannot be taken. You helped write those trust protections." "The originals were likely destroyed in the fire," Harold murmured. "But you keep duplicates. You always did." Miriam placed a handwritten note beside the clipping. "This is Robert's handwriting confirming your arrangement. I've never shown this to anyone." Harold stared at the note for a long moment, then sighed deeply. "Give me an hour." Across town, Tobias Reed hunched over a microfilm reader in the newspaper's dusty archive room. Decades of local reporting scrolled past his tired eyes as he tracked property transfers, zoning changes, and committee appointments. "Got you," he muttered, scribbling notes as connections emerged. 3 shell companies tied to Celia Mercer had systematically acquired properties surrounding the church over 18 months. Each acquisition followed the same pattern: nuisance complaints, code violations, pressure on owners, then purchase below market value. Tobias pulled property tax records showing how parcels changed hands through different corporate entities, all leading back to Mercer's development group. More damning were the Planning Commission minutes, where Mercer's representatives discussed obstacle removal before the final phase could begin. He printed everything, compiled his notes, and called Lena. "I've got the paper trail," he said. "It's not just about Elijah. It's about erasing the last affordable housing in the district." Jamal Turner waited nervously in the corner booth of a coffee shop 2 blocks from the police station. His leg bounced under the table as he checked his watch again. The message had been cryptic. "I have what you need. Not at the station." 4:30. At 4:32, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes slid into the seat across from him. She wore civilian clothes, but carried herself like someone used to uniforms. "You're taking a big risk," Jamal said quietly. The dispatcher, Jamal knew her only as M, pushed a USB drive across the table. "My brother was homeless for 3 years. Father Elijah found him shelter, got him into treatment. I can't watch this happen." Jamal's hand closed around the drive. "What's on it?" "Garage security audio from Easter morning. The system backs up to my department before daily purges." She leaned closer. "Doyle and Harlan didn't know it was running when they arrived early. They talk about making an example of the priest. Harlan jokes about arresting him during communion for maximum effect. Doyle mentions the zoning meeting directly." Jamal felt his heart race. "Why are you helping us?" She stood to leave. "Because I have to live with myself tomorrow." She paused. "That file never existed. I was never here." After she left, Jamal plugged the drive into his laptop and listened through earbuds. His eyes widened as Harlan's voice came through clearly. "So we grab the preacher right at the altar? That'll show these people who's really in charge." Doyle's measured response chilled Jamal more. "Just make sure it's public. He needs to be discredited before Tuesday's vote. Mercer's been very clear about the timeline." Lena Boone sat at a folding table in the church community room, surrounded by worried faces. 3 parish bookkeepers, 5 housing residents, 2 contractors, and a retired bank manager had gathered at her request. "We need to reconstruct every financial decision," she explained, spreading papers across the table. "Every repair, every emergency expense, every loan." The senior bookkeeper, Mrs. Peterson, produced a worn ledger. "I've kept duplicate records for 30 years. Old habit from when we couldn't afford computers." The bank manager examined Elijah's personal mortgage papers. "This is clearly a bridge loan. He used his own home as collateral to cover emergency repairs when the contractor disappeared with the deposit. Every penny went to keeping those apartments habitable." One by one, they pieced together the paper trail, showing Elijah's desperate efforts to maintain housing for vulnerable families when promised donor funds were delayed. "He never told anyone he mortgaged the rectory," Lena said. "He didn't want the congregation to worry." "That's Elijah," said one resident, a single mother of 3. "He gave us his own space heaters last winter when our building's furnace broke." By 6 o'clock, they had signed statements from everyone involved in the church's finances, confirming every expense was legitimate and documented. As twilight deepened over St. Bartholomew's, cars began arriving in the parking lot. Miriam's Buick, Tobias's ancient sedan, Jamal's bike. They gathered in the church basement, faces both exhausted and energized by what they'd found. Miriam placed a thick folder on the table. The trust documents. Harold made copies after hours. They confirm what we suspected. The church properties were placed in protected charitable trust in 1967. They cannot be seized through emergency proceedings or transferred without full diocesan review. Tobias added his stack of papers. Complete timeline of Mercer's land grab. Pattern of targeted enforcement. Shell companies. Everything. Jamal set his laptop down. "And I've got Doyle and Harlan on tape planning the whole thing. Talking about timing the arrest to embarrass Elijah before the zoning vote." Lena spread out the financial records and sworn statements. "And we can prove every penny Elijah spent went to keeping people housed and fed." Elijah looked at the evidence arrayed before them. For the first time in days, a small smile crossed his face. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "the truth speaks for itself." That evening, the church basement hummed with tense energy. Fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows as Lena organized index cards with witness names, arranging them in precise order for maximum impact at tomorrow's council meeting. "Housing residents first," she muttered. "Then the bookkeeper. Then the contractors who can verify every penny spent." Tobias hunched over an ancient copier that wheezed and clicked, producing duplicate packets of their evidence. His fingers were stained with ink, his eyes red-rimmed from hours squinting at documents. 20 sets, he said, stacking another completed packet. "Everyone on the council gets one, plus extras for press and public record." At a corner table, Jamal sat with headphones on, replaying the garage audio. His face tensed each time he heard Chief Doyle's voice crackling through. "Make sure he's cuffed where everyone can see. This needs to hurt." The young man adjusted levels, marked timestamps, and prepared the recording for tomorrow's playback. 4 church volunteers stood guard at the basement entrances, watching for any sign of police or unwelcome visitors. The community had formed a protective ring around St. Bartholomew's, taking shifts throughout the night. Elijah moved between groups, his presence steady, despite the exhaustion visible in his face. "Remember," he reminded them, "this isn't about revenge. It's about truth." Miriam looked up from organizing the trust documents. "Truth with consequences, Father. Those are not mutually exclusive." A commotion at the side door interrupted them. One of the volunteers entered, looking confused. "Someone's here. Says he needs to speak with you." Officer Nolan Pike stepped into the basement, still wearing his uniform but missing his badge. His face was pale, his posture stiff with shame. The room fell silent. "I didn't think you'd come back," Lena said coldly. Pike's eyes darted around the room. "I shouldn't be here. But there's more you need to know." Tobias stopped the copier. Jamal removed his headphones. Elijah stepped forward, his expression unreadable. After I took back my statement, Pike began, his voice barely audible, I overheard a call between Doyle and someone working for Mercer. They were panicking about the videos, about public opinion shifting. He swallowed hard. The fire wasn't random. It wasn't your people trying to hide evidence. It was ordered when they realized they might lose control of the narrative. You have proof of this? Tobias asked sharply. Pike shook his head. Not directly about the fire, but I have the text messages about the coordinated Easter arrest. I have the timestamps showing we received those fraud documents before any investigation happened. And I was there when Harlan bragged about making sure the arrest would happen during Mass for maximum visibility. Why now? Jamal demanded. You already backed out once. Pike's shoulders sagged. Because I can't sleep. Because my grandmother sits in the third pew every Sunday and raised me to know better. Because this badge was supposed to mean something different. Elijah studied the officer for a long moment. Your testimony doesn't erase what happened. No, Father, it doesn't. But the truth matters more than my pride or your comfort, Elijah continued. If you're willing to stand up tomorrow and speak what you know, we'll accept it. Lena looked skeptical, but added another index card to her witness list. Last slot, she said. Maximum impact after we've laid the foundation. Pike nodded. I'll be there. Whatever happens after. That's tomorrow's problem, Miriam said firmly. Across town, in a wood-paneled study, Celia Mercer swirled amber liquid in a crystal glass. Chief Doyle sat across from her, his posture rigid. The meeting is a formality, Mercer assured him. The vote is already arranged. 5-2, possibly 6-1 if Henderson stays in line. And if they bring up the garage recording? Doyle asked. Inadmissible. Obtained without proper channels. Your legal team will object, and procedure will protect us. She smiled thinly. That's the beauty of the system, Raymond. It's designed to work for people like us. Doyle nodded, but his eyes betrayed uncertainty. And Pike? A young officer confused by pressure. His word against yours. Who do you think the council will believe? She set down her glass with a decisive click. By this time tomorrow, the church property will be in receivership, and our timeline stays intact. Back at St. Bartholomew's, volunteers began filtering out as midnight approached. The packets were copied, the testimony organized, the evidence secured in multiple locations to prevent any last-minute sabotage. Finally, only Elijah and Lena remained in the basement. Elijah walked to a small closet and removed the purple Easter vestments he had been wearing during his arrest. Though cleaned, they still showed signs of damage. A torn seam where Harlan had grabbed him, a faint stain where communion wine had spilled during the struggle. He folded them carefully, his movements deliberate and reverent. You're not wearing the black ones tomorrow? Lena asked, watching him. No, Elijah said quietly. I'll wear these again. The same ones they saw when they put me in handcuffs. He smoothed the fabric with his palm. I want the town to see exactly who stood at the altar that day, and who really desecrated it. Lena nodded, understanding the symbolism. The damaged vestments would speak volumes without a single word. Get some rest, she told her brother. Tomorrow, we finish this. The next morning dawned clear and bright, a sharp contrast to the storm brewing inside City Hall. By 8 o'clock, the council chamber was already at capacity, with people lining the walls, crowding the doorways, and spilling down the corridors. Outside, hundreds more gathered on the lawn, where volunteers had set up speakers so everyone could hear the proceedings. Elijah Boone arrived flanked by his sister, Lena. He wore the same purple vestments from Easter Sunday, now carefully mended but still bearing the subtle marks of his humiliation. A murmur rippled through the crowd at the sight. The message was unmistakable. Miriam Vale sat in the front row, spine straight, her white hair perfectly arranged beneath a simple hat. Tobias Reed positioned himself near the press table, notebooks and documents stacked neatly before him. Jamal Turner carried a small laptop and audio equipment, his face solemn with the weight of what he carried. And at the back, partially hidden but present, stood Officer Nolan Pike, pale and resolute. Chief Raymond Doyle entered with the confidence of a man who believed the system would protect him. He nodded to council members as he took his seat. Celia Mercer arrived moments later in an elegant gray suit, her smile practiced and cold. Mayor Evelyn Price called the emergency meeting to order, her voice tight with the strain of keeping control. "We are here to address serious concerns regarding St. Bartholomew's Church finances and property, and to determine whether temporary receivership is required." Celia Mercer spoke first, her tone measured and reasonable. "This is a matter of public safety and fiscal responsibility," she said. "The suspicious fire in the records room has destroyed critical documentation. Without proper oversight, we cannot ensure that church funds are being managed appropriately." Chief Doyle followed, standing at the podium with rehearsed solemnity. "My department has uncovered concerning irregularities. Father Boone took out loans without proper authorization. Money has been diverted from designated accounts, and now key records have been destroyed in what appears to be arson." He paused for effect. "These are not actions of transparent leadership." The room hummed with tension as Lena Boone approached the podium. She carried a thick folder of bank statements, mortgage documents, and spreadsheets. "My brother took a second mortgage on the rectory," she began, her voice strong and clear. "Not for personal gain, but because the contractor who was supposed to repair the church housing units disappeared with the deposit money. 27 families would have been displaced." She placed document after document on the overhead projector. "Every dollar is accounted for. Every emergency expenditure documented. The only irregularity was an act of sacrifice to protect people when systems failed them." 3 tenants testified next, a single mother, an elderly veteran, and a young immigrant family. Each described how Mercer's representatives had approached them weeks before Easter, offering cash to vacate their homes with warnings about coming changes to the neighborhood. "They told me inspectors would find reasons to condemn the building if necessary," the mother said, her voice shaking, "that I should take the money and go quietly." Tobias Reed's presentation hit like precise hammer blows. He projected a timeline on the wall, connecting safety complaints, code violations, and purchase offers through a web of shell companies. "All roads lead back to Beacon Heights Development," he concluded, "owned by Celia Mercer. The same complaints used to justify the Easter raid came from entities she controls." The same week, Father Elijah publicly opposed selling church property. Mercer's face remained composed, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped her pen. Miriam Vale didn't need documents. She stood before the council, her voice carrying the weight of decades in the town. "I've lived in this community for 70 years, she began. "I've watched good people stay silent, because speaking up meant discomfort. I've seen cruelty called order when it profited the right people." Her gaze swept the chamber. "Shame on us. Shame on this town for allowing a good man to be dragged from his altar because he refused to abandon people no one else wanted to see." A hush fell over the room as Pike walked forward. His uniform was pressed, his badge polished, but his face showed the cost of his decision. "The Easter operation was planned in advance," he stated flatly. "We were instructed to enter during Mass for maximum public impact. Officer Harlan specifically said we would have Father Boone in bracelets by noon. The goal was to humiliate him before he could rally opposition to the property development." Doyle half rose from his seat. "This officer is under investigation for procedural violations. His testimony is—" "Let him finish," Mayor Price interrupted, her resolve visibly strengthening. But it was Jamal who delivered the final blow. He connected his laptop to the chamber's sound system and pressed play. Doyle's voice filled the room. "Make it public. Make it stick. We need to break the preacher before he grandstands over the property deal." Harlan's voice responded, "Don't worry, Chief. By Sunday night, nobody in town will stand with him." Absolute silence fell. Then the room erupted. Gasps, shouts, cries of outrage. Mayor Price hammered her gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. White-faced, she turned to the city attorney. "I am suspending Chief Doyle and Officer Harlan effective immediately, pending full investigation." Her voice gained strength with each word. "And I am canceling the vote on church receivership." As if on cue, 3 men and 2 women in suits entered from the back of the chamber. They displayed badges. "State Bureau of Investigation. We'll need all records related to this matter," the lead agent announced, approaching the council table. "And we'd like Chief Doyle to accompany us for questioning." Doyle stood frozen, his authority crumbling before everyone's eyes. Mercer was already moving toward an exit, but another agent stepped into her path. The truth had finally broken free. The crowd erupted outside City Hall. People hugged strangers, some with tears streaming down their faces. The clear blue sky seemed to celebrate with them as St. Bartholomew's bells rang out across town, announcing what everyone already felt. Truth had won. Father Elijah Boone stepped through the heavy doors and paused at the top of the marble steps. He stood tall in his repaired purple vestments, the same ones he'd worn when Officer Harlan had humiliated him at the altar. The fabric had been cleaned, stitched with care, the torn sleeve mended with tiny, precise stitches. Like Elijah himself, the vestments had been restored, but still carried the marks of what had happened. The crowd fell silent when they saw him, then burst into applause that rolled like thunder. Elijah raised his hand, not in triumph, but in blessing. Lena rushed forward to embrace her brother, her eyes wet with tears she'd held back for days. "You were right," she whispered. "They wanted a spectacle. Now they've got one." Behind them, Doyle was being escorted to a state police vehicle, his face ashen. The man who had orchestrated Elijah's public humiliation was now experiencing his own. Nearby, Officer Harlan argued furiously with another agent, his swagger replaced with desperate panic. Celia Mercer tried to slip away through a side exit, but cameras followed her retreat. The documents Miriam had secured proved what no one had been able to prove before. The church properties were protected by an ironclad charitable trust established decades ago. Mercer's entire development scheme had depended on seizing those properties through the emergency receivership vote. "It's dead in the water," Tobias told anyone who would listen, his reporter's notepad filled with fresh details. "Every shell company, every fake complaint, every bribe, it's all coming out now." Officer Pike stood apart from the celebration, watching quietly until Jamal approached him. "You did the right thing," Jamal said, not offering forgiveness, but acknowledging the cost. Pike nodded. "Too late, though." "Better late than never," Jamal replied, thinking of all the people who'd never spoken up at all. The celebration continued into evening. Restaurants donated food. Someone set up speakers playing gospel music. Children danced on the courthouse lawn that had never before seen such joy. By sunset, a black town car pulled up, and the bishop stepped out. He looked uncomfortable, caught between church politics and undeniable truth. The crowd parted as he approached Elijah. "Father Boone," he began formally, then faltered. The prepared statement wouldn't come. Instead, he said simply, "I failed you." Elijah didn't make it easy for him, but he didn't reject him either. He waited. "The diocese will cover all costs to rebuild the records annex," the bishop continued, finding his voice. "And we're establishing a permanent fund to expand the church housing program." He paused. "I hope you can forgive my hesitation when you needed support most." "Forgiveness requires truth first," Elijah replied, his voice carrying. "We have that now." The bishop nodded, understanding the message. He would need to earn back trust, just like everyone else. The next few days passed in a blur of action. State investigators seized files from the police station and Mercer's office. Reporters from larger cities arrived to cover what was now a statewide scandal. Volunteers worked to salvage what they could from the burned annex, organizing documents that had survived the flames. Through it all, Elijah moved with quiet purpose, visiting parishioners, counseling those who had been afraid, and preparing for Sunday. When that morning arrived, the church grounds couldn't contain the crowd. Folding chairs stretched across the lawn. People who had never attended church stood side by side with lifelong members. Volunteers had set up long tables for the meal that would follow service, and Lena directed food preparations with military precision. Miriam sat in the front row, elegant in her Sunday best. Beside her sat the mayor, the feed store owner, teachers, factory workers, and families from the church housing, a visual testament to the new unity. Jamal moved through the gathering with his camera, no longer documenting injustice, but capturing healing. Near the church steps, children knelt with colored chalk, drawing flowers and crosses on the concrete. At precisely 10 o'clock, Elijah emerged from the church. The choir began to sing, voices rising in harmony that seemed to lift the very air. He stood before his expanded congregation wearing the same vestments from Easter morning, now a symbol not of humiliation, but of endurance. "Today we speak of resurrection," he began, his voice strong and clear, "not just as something that happened 2,000 years ago, but as something that happens whenever buried truth rises again." People nodded, some wiping tears. They thought arresting one priest would silence a community, he continued. They were wrong. They thought fear would make you look away. They were wrong about that too. The sermon wasn't long, but it touched every heart. Elijah spoke of consequence, not revenge. He talked about systems that punish compassion and reward cruelty. Most importantly, he spoke about what happens when people stop whispering and stand together. When communion began, the line stretched beyond sight. Everyone was welcome. The meal that followed was just as inclusive. Tables overflowing with food brought by every neighborhood, every background, every class. As the celebration continued, 3 children finished their chalk art near the church steps. In large, colorful letters, they had written 3 simple words that captured everything the town had learned. We showed up. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.